you see either in an Excel spreadsheet, which is just a series of numbers, or it could be a graph that you somehow or another convert into sound waves. So that's the basics behind what sonification is about. There's been a lot of people who've done experiments over the years where they've literally taken images and converted those images straight into sound. And I can discuss some of the programs used to do that later on. And there are individuals who have taken things like stock market data and converted the rising and falling progressions of the stock market data and turned it into music. The gentleman by the name of Johannes Kreidler is the one who is most recognized for doing stuff like that. So that's the germ, the basis for all of this. And our involvement with the project came in a series of meetings with the USA Today journalists where they gave us the Excel spreadsheet that contained literally 100+ years of rainfall data. And then we sat down and figured out, okay, how do we convey what these numbers are telling us into sound and actually make it make sense?
Cool, thank you for that. So this intrigues me on so many different levels. Because there's clearly a journalistic aspect to this. There's a creative aspect of this, both musically creative and sound design creativity. There's also some technical considerations that go into all of this. So let's start, since you mentioned spreadsheet, let's start with what hopefully for most of our students is the low-hanging fruit of the spreadsheet comparison. Very often we hear MIDI being referred to as kind of the spreadsheet view of music. Is it safe to assume that MIDI was an important tool in trying to translate the rainfall data into musical data?
Absolutely. And to kind of explain how that works, I'm going to use an analogy that I used to actually convey in class and used to discuss ways of, oddly enough, getting out of creative ruts. And it was something that I learned years ago when I studied music theory at the University of Florida under Dr. James Paul Sane. At the time, he wrote a C major scale on the board. And so you just had C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And underneath those individual notes, he wrote a number. And so the beginning of the scale, C, was just number 1, number 2 was D, and so on up and through the entire major scale. And then he said, all right, and granted, this was a totally different time where people didn't get as upset about things like this. He then said, so-and-so, what's your phone number? And, one of my fellow classmates, indicated what their phone number was. And he then proceeded to take that phone number and say, look, this phone number contains 7 numbers. And with the 7 numbers, why don't we replace each one of these numbers with one of the ones that's found in that scale? So very quickly, a phone number became a melody line. Well, that same thing occurs when you look at any kind of source that has numbers, including the Excel spreadsheet that we were looking at, where it had rainfall data, and the rainfall data was, measured in inches per year. So sometimes it was 32.07, other times it was 36.3, and so on and so forth. And so one of the approaches I specifically took was, I once again wrote the C major scale on a sheet of paper. And from that C major scale, I wrote a series of numbers. And I looked at the range of numbers that were in the Excel spreadsheet and said, okay, well, let's make this number right here represent MIDI number so-and-so, which represented the number C, or the note C. And then all the other numbers that were found in the Excel spreadsheet were then mapped to different MIDI pitch values, if you will. And so then, if I could then play that back in a MIDI sequencer, I was able to take the actual rainfall amounts and convert them into musical pitches. And yes, I do have an example of that I'm more than happy to play if you're interested in hearing that.
Absolutely. Hit us.
So let me go and share the screen very, very quickly. It is an example in which I took the annual rainfall amount, and like I said, I converted the individual rainfall amount values into MIDI notes. So what you're going to hear is a rising and falling of the melody, which corresponds to the rainfall, and this happens to be for the state of Pennsylvania. Oops, sorry, I moved my mouse. Try that again. So in this example, the plucked string that you heard was representing the actual changing of the rainfall amount year by year, and the additional sounds that you were hearing, some of the lower pitched instruments, were representing when the rainfall was in a more of a drought period. And the higher pitched ones, which included the sound of things like piccolos and xylophones, represented when it was in a very, very, very wet period. So that way I was able to convey a couple things simultaneously with that same piece.
Cool. So just to be sure everybody's on the same page here, literally we had 100 and some odd notes, and the higher the note, the higher the pitch, the greater the rainfall for the corresponding year. Is that basically right?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay. So I want to talk more about how you parse the data into musical terms, but first I want to ask you about the key that you chose, because you mapped that all out in the scale of C major, but then you put it over an A drone so that it's in A minor instead of C major, minor tending to be a more somber feeling than major, which tends to be a happier feeling. So what made you choose to put it in a more minor key implication?
Very interesting question, which kind of goes back to one of the initial questions that you had regarding kind of looking at the data. And this is where, as a data sonificationer or sonificationist, if you will, my job is very much, it's the same as any composer, in which I'm trying to accurately convey what is being presented. And with that, the discussions that we all had, Dr. Tim Stallman and Thomas Owen, who were the other two composers involved, and the USA Today folk, we were making sure that we stayed very true to what was trying to be conveyed in the article, and the things that we became very aware of by looking at the data, both numerically as well as sonically, and also from graphically, is that we happen to be in a period now where we're in a much wetter period than we've been in quite a number of years. And then there's also been some times where there have been more droughts. So what I was trying to do myself, convey sonically this notion that this is serious. We're seeing much more higher than average rainfall amounts occurring, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm trying to convey this in a way that makes people suddenly become a little bit more aware of things. If I had just stuck to a C major scale, which was what I started doing, I found that, oh, it's happy and it sounds great and it's joyful and joyous, but that betrays the whole point of what is occurring with the rainfall amounts and what was trying to be conveyed with the article. And that's when I realized, hey, if I shift this into a minor key, it presents a little bit more of a feeling of immediacy, of, hey, we have to do something. And that was one of the aspects that the article was trying to convey.
So that's beautifully said. Thank you. One of the things that fascinated me about this project is the journalistic aspect. We'll get back to the technical and artistic aspects in just a second, but yeah. In talking with the journalists, one of the things that immediately jumped out at us was that two things were happening pretty broadly in the United States over the last 100 and some odd years, which is that in many states, the first half of the century was typified by very record dry years, and the last half of the century was typified by a record number of high rainfall years. And the other thing that happened was in many states, the change from wet to dry went from kind of moderate change for the first half to three-quarters of the century to increasingly drastic changes from year to year, from record low to record high, and back and forth, this sort of whipsaw effect, which shows, generally speaking, wetter and more volatile conditions as the century progressed. There are ways in drawing a graph, in choosing one's words, or in choosing one's sounds and notes, that one could turn that into a movie soundtrack where you're trying to intensify the feeling of panic and drama and stress and so forth. And one of the first conversations that we had with the journalists was how to convey our genuine perception of the data in a way that was compelling without really putting our thumb on the scale.
Yes. And I actually tried many different approaches. And a lot of the reasons why I chose the instruments, the sounds that I did, was especially like the pluck strings, which convey more of the sound of time marching on. By choosing the plucked pizzicato strings, it does convey more of that sense of mystery, of a dread that's coming up. But getting to that whiplash effect, which we noted, the choice of instruments, of using some more instruments which are more on the low side, the low register of the orchestra versus the higher pitched ones, made it so that when we were in those areas of whiplash, the contrast sonically between those was much more apparent, which got into a little bit more of the heart and soul of what was going on. But at the same time, I tried other experiments where I had just a basic piece of music which had a very repetitive motif or a phrase that would play over and over. And I would use the rainfall data as a method of either increasing or decreasing the tempo of the piece. And that was some interesting, results from that. But ultimately, by the end of it, you couldn't really truly tell what was going on in the piece just because things were increasing so rapidly that there was no recognizable change. On the Whiplash years, it was way too extreme, and I was just realizing, no, this isn't working, and that's where I kind of fell on the use of the pitch values. But you can do things like tempo, and like I said, that was one of the experiments that I had played around with, and just realized very quickly that while it may have satisfied an artistic itch, from a journalistic standpoint, you really weren't able to tell what was going on. Right.
So that's interesting when you talk about using the data to create tempo change events. Very interesting concept. But interestingly enough, all of the final versions that you and Tim and Thomas produced kept the same tempo, because this is time-based data. And so you all landed on the progression of year by year being steady so that you could actually kind of perceive the whole century at a pace, not at a century's pace, but in a, in a minute or two, you could actually hear the 100 years tick by at a steady pace and let the data speak for itself within that time context.
That is exactly what happened, and some of the discussions and conversations that we had specifically involved what's the most appropriate length of time for this piece of music, and it was very interesting because if you look at the different pieces that the three of us composed, I think I had the shortest length of the pieces, and I believe Tim had one which was significantly longer. And I had come upon where the length of time for mine, as far as the general tempo, simply because I knew I was dealing with that pluck string line, and I realized that if I was to play this a little bit too slowly, that the retention, the memory of what occurred previously would have gone away. So I was playing a lot with what's the appropriate tempo and the appropriate length for the piece, and I went through many iterations before absolutely, coming upon this is the right one. And some of them just went at a breakneck speed, and I realized, well, that's really great, but nope, that's too fast. And then others were, I don't even remember what happened at the beginning of the piece.
How long was a year in the context of your piece?
I believe in this case that my tempo was, I probably should have written that down. I believe the tempo was somewhere around, I want to say it was around 120. It may have been just a little bit below that.
So that is one year per beat?
Yes, every beat is literally 1 year.
Okay.
And it was very unusual because of it. Every year being an individual downbeat. If you were to go ahead and write this out on a piece of staff paper, then the sheet music, the piece would have actually been in a tempo of a meter of 10/8. So 10 years per decade.
Oh, right, 10 years per decade.
At an eighth note pulse. I can honestly say I've never written a piece before in 10/8 until now. And this was it. So I was like, okay.
There you go. So one of the other aspects that's interesting to me about this is how you translate the scale of rainfall data into a reasonable musical range, because if you had, I don't even know what 25 inches of annual rainfall means musically. How vast were the variations of rainfall from year to year, and how did you scale that up or down into an appropriate musical context?
Depending on the state, there were sometimes 40 inches of variance, and in other states, it was only, say, about 10 inches. Now, this was another area where I did a lot of different experiments. One of those was literally just taking the rainfall amount, and let's say, just for example, 32.8, and literally took the value of 32.8 and converted that into a tone that I could generate with any basic tone generator. So 32.8 became a frequency of 32.8, a sine wave. And I very quickly realized that, no, that did not work. In fact, the fluctuations between some of the rainfall amounts was so minuscule that no, there's no way you could really make any good sense of that. I ended up getting the most bang or mileage out of a program called Max MSP, which is released by and developed by a company called Cycling 74. Once upon a time, I actually taught it. And one of the things which Max can do very, very, very easily is it can scale data, meaning you take an incoming set of numbers and say, hey, take these numbers right here, and now convert it to a different set of numbers. So the lowest value gets translated, if you will, to a different, more appropriate setting. So I, once again, experimented by taking how I scaled the data. So, I looked at it and said, I think a 2-octave range is the most appropriate. And so I took the rainfall amount and scaled it to a range of 2 octaves. And that made it a lot easier to be able to trace the yearly changes of the rainfall amounts. Like I said, I tried a lot of different variables on that. Some which was a 1-to-1 relationship, so 4 octaves, and I realized, oh, whoa, that's way too extreme. It sounded great if your idea of great is you took a cat and threw it on a piano and
right.
let it just run around on the piano, because you would bounce from the lowest register to the highest register, and it was very accurate, but not aesthetically pleasing. So by scaling the data, I was able to stay true to the actual data that was being reported, but do it in such a way that you can hear the shape and the contour of what was going on in the piece.
Cool. I want to come back to the aesthetic aspect of it in just a second, but first let me kind of dig a little bit deeper into what you just said about translating the numbers into the rainfall numbers into musical numbers. So if you've got 40 inches of variation of rainfall data, and you need to scale this into 2 octaves, there are diatonically 15 notes in a 2-octave scale. And if you haven't taken Principles of Music yet, then lay for that, because you're going to want to be able to understand that clearly. So you got basically 15 notes. So one thing is that you need to scale the data so that it fits within that, shrink it and swell it like an accordion so that it fits into that context. The other thing that you need to do is, I'm going to borrow the word quantize, which in sequencing we ordinarily use to talk about rounding a rhythm up or down to the nearest grid rhythmically. But in this case, we're talking about taking a pitch and rounding it up or down to the nearest diatonic tone, the nearest tone found in a C major scale, for example. So like 38.5 hertz and 38.6 hertz wouldn't end up as different notes. They would end up probably rounding up to the same exact pitch. So you quantize it to the scale that you're working with and scale it to a reasonable music dimension, and that's how you find something that works. Is that basically right?
That's absolutely spot on. Another way of thinking about it is we use the concept of quantizing pitch on a fairly regular basis when we use programs like Antares Autotune or Celemoni's Melodyne. Both of those take a look at the frequency of what's being input of the human voice, and if you're in between two notes, it will nudge it either up or down depending on how sharp or flat you are. And in this case, yes, there were instances where the rainfall amount would have fallen between two notes. Mm-hmm. And so in the case, it was the rainfall amount, if you will, was more or less quantized. So yes, it was just nudged up or down just a small, tiny little bit. But there was, I'm trying to think if there were any instances where there were two notes played back to back which were identical that were ended up rounded, and I don't believe there were. I think it was very bizarre and strange that happened, but that was definitely something I was looking out after.
Mm-hmm. Cool. By the way, if anyone has questions you have for Marc about this process, please enter them into the YouTube chat, and we'll do our best to get to those and get you good answers. So you mentioned the idea of aesthetic value a minute ago, and shortly before that you talked about choosing a length of time that made it listenable. So it quickly became evident during our conversations with USA Today that one of the things that we needed to do was to create things that people would actually listen to and listen all the way through. Because if you only listen to the first 10 seconds of a 2-minute composition, you wouldn't get the whole grasp of it. If you have a visual, someone can look at a graph of something and immediately say, oh, look, all of the low rainfall years are clustered here, and all of the high rainfall years are clustered here. They're highlighted orange and they're highlighted blue. And at a glance, see that. But when you're conveying it in musical terms, you have to let people, you have to entice people to listen to it the whole way through. So can you talk about some of the decisions that you made with regard to trying to make it interesting and compelling and palatable enough that people would actually listen the whole way through?
Sure. I tried a lot of different concepts. I experimented with the overall length of the piece. I experimented with the different timbres, the different instruments. I experimented with the key, the musical key that everything was presented in. And I created a lot of different variations. And with these variations, oh, my poor wife, she heard a ton of things. But the beautiful thing is that she loves music. She is a music lover. She has a natural, keen ear for music, but she is not an actual trained musician. But every now and then, when I would be, trying some of these ideas out, I would just happen to, walk off and go into the other room, and she would say, I really like what you did there. I could tell what was going on. And she, would say, I could tell that in the beginning that things were, a drought, and then towards the end it sounded like we were just getting plummeted, with the rain. And when she said that, that's when I knew, aha, I am onto it. I now have figured this out. So sometimes you can get kind of stuck in your own head, if you will, going through these ideas, and then you'll occasionally have another set of ears that'll just say something that helps clue you in. Now, I know I mentioned it before. I experimented with different lengths of the piece, and I found that if it was spaced out too far, then that sense of immediacy was lost. Not to mention the memory recognition, and I also tried other sounds, other instruments, which even I found to be quite annoying after they were playing for a certain amount of time. And if after 10 seconds I don't want to hear the same thing, then that's a problem. So I was constantly straddling this fine line between what I think sounds good from a pure piece of music that I would want to listen to over and over again versus, is this telling what the journalistic story is?
Right. So you talk about having another set of ears. One of the things that we did was to play early drafts of these examples. Yes. And by we, I mean I was there in the conversation, but it had nothing to do with the actual composition that you guys did. But you and Thomas and Tim played early drafts for the journalists that we were working with and shared them with each other. One of our colleagues, Michael Scicciano, who teaches game audio composition over in the music production program, was also in on the conversation and had a great impact on the discussion of how we would approach this and all these things. So it is great to have that kind of collaborative process. One of the things that I mentioned to you, and off the top of my head, I don't know if you ended up using it in any of your final versions or not, but at one point I suggested that in order to kind of maintain musical interest to compel people to listen all the way through, maybe you could have a chord progression that helped convey the passage of time. Did that work out, or did you abandon it?
I did. It was actually one of the pieces that I did submit. It didn't ultimately get used in the article, but I absolutely did use that, and I'm more than happy to play that as well.
Sure, I think it's time to play at least one more example. We've still got a few minutes, so another example or two would be great.
Yeah, the piece that I'm playing here took what the feedback that you gave me to heart, where I was trying to make it a more recognizable piece of music, if you will, so it had a more definitive chord progression, and the melody line, which is being played by the violin, signified how much rainfall was heard in that specific decade, so it's more done by rank. So this one was a little bit more of a subjective piece, and that was it was interesting. There was some really good feedback that we received about it, which I'll share afterwards. Now, in this specific piece, I did try doing a different chord for every decade, but it didn't sound right when I did that. It sounded off. So I let the melody line help dictate what chords I could play. So yes, I absolutely tapped into my music theory background and recognizing, well, if I'm on this note here, what are the chords that are available that I could use, and I was able to create the progression as you heard right there. I was a little upset that it didn't get chosen, but I understand why that piece didn't necessarily get chosen, and that's because it's not as recognizable as far as exactly what was going on with regards to the data itself.
I find myself listening to the music and not registering the data.
That was the exact result that happened with everybody who listened to that piece. In fact, the comment that kept on getting thrown around was, I really feel awful. This makes me feel so sad for the environment, which, hey, I did my job. But at the same time, there was too much of a focus on the musical aspect of it and not enough upon what was really trying to be conveyed, with regards to the data. And I will play the one of the pieces that was accepted, and this is where, if you listen to the sounds on their own, you get one sense of meaning, but when you combine them with the visuals, the meaning becomes even more immediate. In this piece, I was trying to show or convey when the wettest years were as versed to the driest years. And when you hear it and when you see the graph simultaneously, it really becomes very, very, very apparent as to what is really going on.
The sonification makes it not less intellectual, but it adds to the intellectual value of the graph and makes it visceral.
Yes, and my hope is that it hits people emotionally as well, and kind of makes them even more aware of what's going on. You can look at numbers. You can take a look at a curve, a graph, and see what's happening with trends, but there's something about sound that we respond to in a different manner.
Yep.
And when you combine those together, that's when that true dawning and realization, I think, occurs, that people become more, I suppose, aware is the best way of describing it. It's because it's hitting different emotional centers of the brain.
So I want to mention to those of you listening, either in real time or on playback, that the tempo slowed down and sped up. That was an artifact of the stream, not part of the composition. You can go listen to Marc's work and the work of Thomas Owen and Tim Stolman, our other faculty composers, by going to the link in the description of today's stream. And I encourage you to do so and check those out, and you'll be able to hear them without that awkward slow down and speed up. Yeah, well, it was mostly good, but in the middle for about 3.5 seconds it did the Zoom thing. So, which is great in conversation, not so great in playing back music. So in about 2 minutes that we have left, Marc, can you tell us about any other sonification plans or projects you have percolating?
Oh, yes. There's never a shortage of numbers. And I started working on a piece right around the same time that this rainfall sonification project came up. This one was using COVID-19 data. And this was just prior to the the Omicron variant. And one of the things I began to notice by looking at the data, and all of this data can very easily be found at organizations like World Health Organization, for instance, or the CDC. And I began noticing that, wait a minute, these numbers are beginning to tick upwards again. What's going on here? And very shortly after that, that's when Omicron really started hitting. I'm not saying that I anticipated. No, I didn't. Not at all. I think it was largely coincidental because it occurred right after Thanksgiving. So that's why the numbers did have a little bit of an uptick. But as the numbers kept on going, I was getting too depressed as far as the music was concerned. Because of how I was approaching it, I was using some very dissonant strings in a choir, and I was just, oh no, this is just too depressing for me to keep on working on this one. So I've put that on the back burner for a while, and instead I've been looking at information regarding the cosmos. So I've been looking at images of stars. I've been looking at the different, there's what they refer to as emission lines of different elements, which more or less a fingerprint for an element. And I've literally taken those images and converted them into sound waves. And the result is a very, very haunting, dark ambient piece, very, very just atmospheric and moody, but I'm hoping to tell some very interesting stories just using that information, whether it's a large-scale piece or just a small one. But regardless, I use sonification as a simple method of being able to get me out of creative ruts, whether it's taking telephone numbers, credit card numbers, and use that to write melody lines just to jumpstart stuff. That's what I'm doing. So that way I don't avoid sitting down at the piano or at the guitar and using the exact same chord progressions. It's allowing me to branch out in ways that I normally wouldn't. In other words, it's getting me out of my head and allowing me to embrace things that I normally would have ignored.
That's awesome. Marc, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. Congratulations on the USA Today article. That's exciting stuff. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for having me. It's always fun to be part of these kind of discussions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's Audio Production Town Hall. We're here every month at the beginning of week 4 to talk about topics of broad interest to audio production students, a different topic every month. If you enjoyed this, then don't hesitate to subscribe and tell your friends about this. Let them know that they missed out on something. You can also always catch this offline through the same link on Full Sail 1. You can find the archived recording on our YouTube channel, and you can also find other past audio production town halls there. So keep in touch with us and with your instructors, and hope you all have a great week 4 and a good month. Take care, everybody.